So I'm going to repeat myself a little bit for those of you who did receive and read the last minute blast that I sent out yesterday, and I'll just repeat it. So for those of you that read that, my apologies for repeating it. It sets the tone, I think, for this morning for what I'm going to talk about. So this fellow by the name of Cletus Siltman. By the way, that's an original name, by the way. I came up with that, Cletus Siltman. Cletus Siltman walked into the town square, and he stood on the corner of Main and First Street, took out his knapsack, set down a cloth on the ground, put out some food and some water, and he sat down in that spot and stared in front of him. And he stayed there. He stayed there all day. He sat there all night, and as folks were making their way home after work, they saw him sitting there. And to their surprise, when they came back to work the next morning, there was Cletus Siltman still sitting there on the corner, staring out. He sat there all that day. Now, this went on for days. And eventually, visitors would notice this fellow. Now, most people didn't take too much mind about it because everyone knew that Cletus was kind of off his rocker most of the time. And so they'd just say, "Hey, Cletus," and they'd keep on walking. But after a while, the residents of that town couldn't help but notice, and the business people in that town couldn't help but notice that other people began to notice that Cletus was noticing something. And so visitors would sit there across the street and have their lunch out on the sidewalk, sitting at a little cafe there, and pretty soon business people began to do the same, and they were all staring at Cletus, staring at nothing. Until finally somebody walked over across the street and said, "Cletus, what are you doing? Do you need something, some food, some money?" And Cletus said, "Nah, I'm good." "Well, what are you doing here?" He says, "Well, what you don't know, and what I do know, is that something, sometime, at some point, is going to happen here. And when it does, I got a front row seat." Now, hang on to that story. We're in the season of Advent, right? This is the season of 4 weeks before the birth of Christ. A season we typically think of in more liturgical churches like the Methodist Church or the Presbyterian or the Episcopal. We think of this season of preparing, of waiting, of anticipating the birth of Jesus. So hang on to that because we're going to come back to this idea of Advent. But I want to jump back and look back about 2,400 years at the text and I'm sharing this theme, by the way, with the whole church, with all the different services. We do this at the high seasons. We sort of share everything. So you can always go over to the main services, either one of them, check them both out, and you'll hear 3 different versions on the same text, which is always fun, I think. So this comes from the Old Testament, from the prophet Nehemiah, from the book of Jeremiah, and it was one of the main prophets during the time of the Babylonian period, so about 2,400 years ago. And this is what he writes. This is God giving Nehemiah a word to give to the people who are in Babylonian exile. He says, "Watch for this." Get the connection, waiting, watching, Advent. "Watch for this, the time is coming," God cried, "when I will keep the promise I made with the families of Israel and Judah. When that time comes, I will make a fresh and true shoot sprout from the David tree. He will run this country honestly and fairly. He will set things right. That's when Judah will be secure and Jerusalem will live in safety. The motto of our city will be, 'God has set things right.' God has made it clear that there will always be a descendant of David ruling the people of Israel, and that there will always be Levitical priests on hand to offer burnt offerings, present grain offerings, and carry on the sacrificial worship in my honor." So, they're in captivity. The prophet speaks for God and says, God says it's all going to come to an end. You're going to be back in your place. You're going to get to be the way you've always wanted to be, the way you always were before you were thrown into captivity. Before whatever you did that made God mad, that caused all this to happen, that you were then put into exile because of the Babylonians, but you'll get to be back. Now, it only took about 500 years, but it came true. It's messy, this stuff in the Old Testament. It's messy this time of Advent as we try to parallel, as much Christianity tries to parallel what happened in the Old Testament with what's happening in the New Testament, as if it's kind of, part of the whole prophetic tradition. It is in the sense that the prophetic tradition speaks to the mythic realities that we find ourselves in. In that sense, it speaks truth. But truth is messy because we want to sometimes think truth is fact or truth is history, and we get all mixed up. The people of Israel exiled, the temple's destroyed, they're without a home, and the important thing to keep in mind here is that this idea of being without a home is a mythic reality. Do you know what I mean by that? I mean we all seek connection. We all seek belonging. They're waiting for home. But it seems to be elusive. It's always under siege by others. It's fragile. It's even contradictory. It's self-destructive at times. People argue over what home should look like, right? When we talk about church as home, people argue about what that home needs to look like. I mean, truth and home and these ideas, it's messy. And whenever I think about the messiness of truth, God, church, politics, actions, inaction, history, I always think of that line from A Few Good Men. You remember that line? Colonel Jessup's being confronted by Caffrey, the Lieutenant Caffrey, who's the Tom Cruise character, and they get into this confrontation where he's finally interrogating him, and he's facing him head on, this force of nature and industrial military complex, Colonel Jessup, who's played by Nicholson, and Jessup is sitting in the chair, and Caffrey says to him, I want the truth, and he says, you think you deserve the truth? Nicholson's character, Colonel Jessup, says, you think you want the truth? He says, I deserve the truth. And then Jessup's character comes back and shouts what? You can't handle the truth. Yeah, isn't that great? Isn't that wonderful? How many times have you said that to your spouse? Or your partner or your friend, Such a great line. You can't handle the truth. But here's the truth. We can't handle the truth. Because the truth is that Jessup did break the law, right? He did break the law. That was proven. He did break the law in giving the order for the harassment of the recruit because he didn't think the recruit was strong enough and it was going to push that recruit. In fact, it pushed him too far until he committed suicide, and so he died from all of that kind of pressure and social pressure, and essentially they committed murder. He ordered that, but that wasn't maybe the intention. It's a little gray there. But the truth of the matter is that was breaking the law. The truth of the matter is also that Jessup was thinking, well, you need the finest, the strongest, the most enduring, the most committed on that wall protecting our country. But the truth of the matter is that the military complex is half the time not about protecting the country, but protecting greed or protecting industry or protecting other kinds of issues or imperialism. It's messy, right? The truth is messy. So here at Advent, we're sort of thinking about what is the truth? What are we really waiting for? It's kind of messy. And we hear these ancient words that the prophet Nehemiah said when he was echoing God's promise to restore the Israelites to their home and their temple, and it parallels the theme echoed in the New Testament hundreds and hundreds of years later when Israel's now under the rule of Rome, just after the fall of the temple in AD 70 now. So we're talking 500-600 years later, and the Gospels are writing in retrospect, here's the new king of David. Here's the new line of David to be king over Israel, the Messiah. So we see the nativity scene is picking up on this myth. But it's picking up on a myth that's become limited. So how do we read a myth that's got a limited perspective, that's got a limited historical context? How do we read it as truth for today? So I want to go back and listen to this other of my favorite prophets, a contemporary of Nehemiah. You'll recognize it. It's Ezekiel, and he's hearing the word of the Lord, again, Babylonian captivity. And he says, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he took me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the midst of a valley of bones. Full of bones. You know this one? Took me around, and I was walking amidst all the bones, passing all around them. And there were so many, the whole valley filled with bones, that they were very dry bones. Because you want to get the idea that this is just nothing. It's a waste of time. This is just exhausted, gone, deplete, nothingness. And then he says, son of dust, which is the way that's interpreted. He says to Ezekiel, son of dust, can these bones live? And Ezekiel answers, Lord, you know. Which I think is a great answer. I don't know, you know. Again he said to me, speak over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, thus says the Lord God to you, I will cause breath to enter you so that you will live. I will lay sinews so that you will grow back flesh, and I will cover you with skin and put breath in you so that you will live. And then Ezekiel goes and he prophesies over the bones and watches as the bones come back to life. What's the story saying? What's the story prophesying? What's it speaking to? Of course, the hope here is the aim of rebuilding. Rebuilding an army, essentially, to come back in and reestablish Israel as their home. Again, that happens about 400 or 500 years later. But here's the thing about story that I want you to catch. What does it say to us today, this idea of waiting? What does it say about this idea of when things are broken, when we're in the midst of grief, which I loved what you said, Sharm, about how you brought about this reality that we live in grief, but grief reminds us of the sharp edges of love. What a great phrase, the sharp edges of love. That's seeing the whole picture. The restitutional model says, you got to fix it. You got to fix this thing. It hurts. It's painful. You got to fix our home. You got to fix this reality that we're living in. It's painful. But the message of God in this story, and I think in the incarnational story of Advent, is fixing it is a different picture. Fixing it transcends the reality with a sense of hope that says, in the midst of the pain, there's redemptive possibilities. Always possibilities. We know that the grief is not the last thing. We know that the pain is not the last thing. We know that things will always have a new chapter, a new way of seeing them. So here I want to talk real quick about a couple of things. I was in the waiting room at Baylor Scott and White, waiting for Linda to go through her surgery. It's a 9-hour surgery, 8-hour surgery, but the whole process was about 9 hours, 10 or total sitting there in the waiting area. You know, it's very isolated because you can only go one family member. That's the one visitor for the day. So I'm sitting there, and what do you do with 8-9 hours on your hands? And you're thinking about the horrible surgery that's happening to your loved one in the surgical room, and that there's a team of 7 people standing around a body playing, operation, that didn't work. What do? You play doctor. So I started thinking about the procedure. I started researching the procedure because I'd known it. I'd sat with a doctor and we'd looked at what was going to be happening beforehand, but I went into detail. What does this thing look like? I didn't go into it very far before I realized I don't want to see what's happening. But I did notice something. It started talking about muscles and sinews and bones. And I remember saying that the doctor telling us that they were going to have to cut through certain fascia and outer muscle to get to something. And I remember thinking, well, that's interesting. I have problems with my joints because I'm missing certain things, ligaments and cartilage and such. So I started looking up the word ligament and bones. Did you know we have 206 bones? Did you know that? You would have thought we had more. I would have. Only 206? Did you know you have 900 ligaments that attach all of those bones? Head bone to the neck bone to the shoulder bone to the backbone. There's a song about that. Them bones gonna rise again. I started looking at this word ligament, and I want to share with you a couple of ideas about words, because you know how much I love words and how much I think we misunderstand words, and so I go curiously digging for the meanings of words because they teach me more than I thought I knew. Did you know what the root word of ligament is? Ligare. Now, you know what that means, right? To connect, to tie. Because that's what ligaments do. They tie bones to bones. They tie structures together. Did you realize, I didn't realize this, but ligaments are made of stuff. Who figured? I just figured they come as ligaments. You can buy them, just ligaments. They're actually woven like braids of rope, of connective tissue and various kinds of fibers that then somehow weave together this strand that creates the strength. All these different things, and they're varied, these 3 different primary materials that then bind a ligament in order to attach to a bone in order to hold the thing together. Are you seeing where I'm going? You seeing the metaphor here? What brings life to life? What brings life to life? What brings hope to difficult times? Connection. And when you think about what's important about the hope of the future of Advent, it's about connection. Now, we call it incarnation, but I think it's more than simply God sending a supernatural, otherworldly deity being in the form of God's own Son in order to sacrifice God's own Son for God's ego so that we can then be loved by God again. I think it's far more profound than that. I think it reminds us at Advent that we are connected at the very ground of our being with this reality of love that invites us into connection with one another and into connection especially in the difficult times. So you know what the word Advent means, right? You think it means waiting? It doesn't. I mean, it does, but I mean, that's the word we've given to it. But go look up the etymology of waiting, and what you find out is fascinating. The two Proto-Indo-European roots, the most ancient sort of universal roots to these words, to the word Advent, ad and vent, come from the word ad, which means to go, and ventir, which means to come. Advent means to come and go. Does that not suggest something interesting about what we're doing during the time of Advent? If you look up the word watch, because I love, again, I'm playing with these words. The word watch is rooted in the root word that means alive. To be alive, not to sit, not to be lethargic, not to be static. The whole reality of the kingdom of God is life, it's living. It doesn't work unless it's living. The whole invitation of Advent is not to wait for something to happen. Something's already happening, right? The whole invitation of waiting for Advent is to not simply pay attention, but to notice the comings and the goings and to participate in connecting these parts, these realities. When we run from what makes us uncomfortable, we're doing the opposite of the gospel. When we find ourselves standing in defense of a position, it's good to be just, it's good to hold our ground on justice, but we're not helping the kingdom when we simply stand on one side of the road and shout to the other side. We have to walk over there and start talking to the other side and start figuring out what's going on. Let's find something out beyond our ideas. Let's find a place where we can begin to make what? Connection. And we make connection. That's right. Advent is about making connection. So here's what I want you to do for the next 4 Sundays, or the next 4 weeks, actually. I shared this with the class this morning that I taught. The African-American theologian, thank you, Howard Thurman. He was there. The African-American theologian Howard Thurman, I don't know if you've ever read any of Howard Thurman. He was a mentor for Martin Luther King Jr. as well as for many others in Kennedy. He was also a professor in New York and also a theologian, a fascinating mystic, really. He had a really mystical orientation to his theological presence. And to be someone of African-American descent and then to speak to his mystical orientation with this sense that transcends that divisive reality that he lived in, that really says a lot. And here's what he said about what God really wants. He said, don't ask what the world needs. He said, ask what makes you come alive. Because if what makes you come alive, you begin to go and do, he says that's what the world needs most. It needs people who are alive. If you're arguing on one side of the fence, you're dead. The bones could rise, but you're not seeing it because you're too stuck, right? The only way to recognize the life is to participate in joining with the other side. Not in what they think, but in connecting in ways that begin to pull the bones together. The bones are going to rise, but they can't rise without our participation in connecting, in noticing, in paying attention, and in connecting, participating. So this week, the next several weeks, I want you to do what Mary Oliver suggests when she says, sometimes I only need to stand wherever I am in order to be blessed. But when she said, when it's over, I want to be a bride to amazement. I want to be a groom, the bridegroom taking the world in my arms. What we want to do during Advent, that I encourage you to do, is to pay attention to the comings and goings in your life. To notice where you find yourself standing so hard that you're not hearing the connection, you're not seeing it, to standing so firm that you're not picking up on that. And then I want you to notice where someone else is doing it, not so that it can be judging, but so that you can be curious and wonder, I wonder why they're so stuck in that spot. I wonder what sticks them there. Because what we know, this is faith. Faith is not belief, because belief is dead. Faith is alive and relational. Faith knows that every moment holds redemptive possibilities. Every single moment holds redemptive possibilities. What else is God if not the redemptive possibilities present in all aspects of our life, inviting us to make the connection? Amen.